So if you're willing, I'd like to ask you, Kyle Tushaus, what is the biggest risk?
Yeah, I think right now everybody's kind of afraid of inflation, which is an interesting business environment to be in for real estate because everybody kind of gravitates towards this industry as a safe haven. I think you can kind of take that a step further and think if I'm going to de-risk myself from inflation, and I'll say inflation I don't think is actually the risk I'm getting at. It's eventually I think there's a risk that I think a lot of people are not thinking about. Some are, but I haven't seen any media headlines about it. But within real estate, right, you might say, okay, well, what's my best inflation hedge within an inflation hedge, right? And that would be a property that I can mark to market more often, right? So the reason why consumer durables doesn't do well in inflation is because I can wait 10 years to buy my next car or washing machine. But bread and butter, I'm going to buy that more often. And so that price can keep going up every time I transact. So how can I mimic that in real estate? Well, the properties that get marked to market more often would be better in inflation environment. So hotels get marked to market every single morning. So it should be the best inflation hedge, but you've got the dual side of that sword that says it's also discretionary spending. So be very careful on that front. But then, so maybe I'm okay with every year, say in multifamily, the triple net 25-year lease would probably be the worst, depending on how that lease got written. So there's obviously a spectrum even within the inflation hedge that is our industry of commercial real estate. But the thing I haven't heard enough people talking about, and the thing that scares me the most and influences a lot of how we're going into this first phase of deals, is that the labor risk that is kind of bubbling under the surface, where you see a lot of these value add deals. I mean, people have been, ever since 2008, value add has been kind of like everybody and their cousin is getting into this idea of renovating a property and popping the value of it. But I think there's going to be a massive moving target into how well you can control those costs. And so for like an interesting data point, since about the early 70s, compensation has gone up 115% since the early 70s, which sounds great. 115% increase in compensation, and that's for non-supervising roles. So the jobs that are actually doing the thing, while productivity of those same jobs has gone up almost 250% during that same time. So there's this massive difference in the throughput that's being provided by somebody in a job versus what they're getting out of it. And I look at the landscape of people now, for the first time in 4 years, even know what inflation is. Our socioeconomic landscape is not great. There's a lot of political strife, and I feel like that gap is probably going to get closed to some degree. And so I see a big risk factor in those business models that are going to be very reliant upon labor as an input, because I think we're about to see a compression of that gap. And I think rightfully so. I mean, you look at some of the numbers and it's just, I might be a little jaded. I came out of school after the '08 collapse. And so I don't really have I don't have that much of an experience through that run up, but you look at what was accomplishable with, say, your base degree or even no degree 30, 40 years ago versus now, and how much, someone's having to work to get the same throughput in terms of quality of life. I don't see it continuing status quo for much longer. Maybe, we kick the can a little bit longer, but I don't see people being willing to do it. And the Great Resignation might be sort of the first little cue of it. But yeah, I think what's about to follow inflation is, we talk about energy prices going up, housing prices going up. When labor prices keep going up, and right now it's the remote workers that are driving, the leverage in those negotiations, it'll eventually get to all labor. And if your investment thesis is heavily dependent upon labor, I would think of some ways to lock that in. Ways that we mitigate that, right? If I see a value add deal, it's got to be in a market where I've already got a pretty good relationship with the GC, and I can go to them and say, do you want to be part of the GP tranche? And so with that, I can say, you're now going to have equity incentive, not just, hourly rate or markup incentive. So, let's put together a budget of a do not to exceed, and you control that cost, but you're also in our cap stack now. Outside of that, I would be very worried about taking that GC risk, because I hear horror stories of colleagues having guys walk off the job for $2 more an hour. And, it kind of sucks when you've already pulled the debt on the deal and you've got, this bridge loan kind of clock ticking away at you. But then you look at the data and you're kind of like, well, I don't necessarily disagree with it. I mean, if someone offered me more, you'd probably do the same thing. And so I think it's something that needs to be taken into consideration when you're underwriting, because I do think that's the next big wave to follow in this inflation run up.